Okay, on to millennials. Millennials were a very planned generation, a very wanted generation. They were raised with a lot of optimism, a lot of positivity. The self-esteem movement in psychology, as we discussed at the beginning, they raised the bar on the individual self. They were kind of see themselves as awesome. So you can measure that statistically. So by 2010, 70% of people believed they would be in the top 20% at work. Today, 80% of incoming college students believe they're above average leaders. You can kind of say that they're, in a sense, their sense of self is a statistical impossibility. There's also grade inflation. So the teachers start giving higher grades, but the hours of homework are going down. So more self-esteem, more telling that they're awesome. Meanwhile, maybe less competence, more of an illusion of competence. And as adults, now that millennials are starting to age a little bit, the plot is kind of thickening for them a little bit because, maybe their expectations are not being met. Maybe their expectations were too high. Their depression rates skyrocketed compared to, even Gen X and boomers before them. 22% of millennials say they have no friends compared to only 9% of boomers. They're very tech savvy, but technology also makes them judge each other a lot and, all the social comparison. Millennials are very central to the West today, to our predicament as the West. They're very high expectations, a lot of technology, a lot of social comparison, and so forth. I guess what I got from your work is it really made it clear how stuck in the middle of a generations-long trend they are, and how a lot of people will judge millennials. It's very trendy with other generations to kind of blame individual millennials, but can you really expect them to be any different looking at how, how powerful these trends are that they're inside? And it kind of made me almost have more empathy for them when I read your chapter on millennials.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that was a real goal in this book, is for the generations to try to understand each other better and to try to start from that place of empathy. Because I think it's really counterproductive when it becomes, but whose fault is it? Is it the millennials' fault or is it the boomers who raised them? It's nobody's fault. These are big cultural changes. We're all participating in them. We've all been shaped by them. And I think it makes more sense to say, let's just start with the premise that there are some differences. People have different perspectives. Generations are one of those perspectives. And let's try to understand each other better. And some of the changes are good. Thus, we're going to argue about whose fault those are too, when the changes are positive. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I think, to focus on that. So it's also, I think it does have to be put in that context in general with generations, that they are shaped by these things that happened before they were born. But at some point, at what point are you going to take responsibility? So it has to be that both things are true, that generations are shaped by those who come before them, but then you have to, at some point, say, okay, this is who we are, and let's move forward.
And do you feel in your research, in your studies, that you feel that there's that is happening among millennials, or perhaps what strategies are millennials employing that might be productive towards that end?
Well, that's a little hard to tell, from the survey data that we've got. One thing that's really encouraging is that millennials have done much better financially than anybody ever expected. So there was the expectation when they were young adults, it's the same thing played out with Gen X, of there's a recession, and so this generation is never going to be able to do as well as their parents. That was said about Gen X in the early 90s. It turned out not to be true. It was said about millennials during the Great Recession, and it also turned out not to be true. That they, particularly those who bought houses before 2020, have done extremely well for themselves. And the most recent analysis from the St. Louis Fed shows that millennials have actually surpassed the wealth of Gen Xers and boomers at the same age, which nobody would have expected 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Even a year ago, when an excerpt of Generations was published in The Atlantic, I just use census data to show that median incomes for young adults were at all-time highs, that the home ownership rate of millennials was only a percentage point or two behind Gen Xers and boomers at the same age, that they were actually doing really well. The main two reactions I got was, oh, you must not have adjusted for inflation. Yeah, it was already adjusted for inflation. The Atlantic never would have published it otherwise. And you're wrong. Well, now the St. Louis Fed has shown, actually, yeah, that millennials, it's not just that they have higher salaries, their wealth building has actually surpassed previous generations.
It's funny because that was a narrative for a very long time.
Very long time.
Millennials are growing up poor, and that it was much easier for boomers, and it was much easier for Gen X, and we're left on the outside looking in. Of course, with 2008, but it's funny how you see like a lot of these things, the way they play out over the long term. You have to kind of wait and see, right? For people to graduate college and get into the workforce and then buy their first home, and it takes time to kind of really get the full picture. In a sense, it's funny. I'm thinking about this for the first time as you say this. Maybe all those high expectations and maybe all that positive self-esteem and so forth, maybe it ended up paying off in the end, no, for the millennials?
Yes and no. So I think some of the overconfidence, probably not. However, them having the high expectation, for example, that they, which is just skyrocketed from boomers to Gen Xers to millennials, of I'm going to go to college, and actually I'm going to go to grad school, and I'm going to, have a professional job. Well, those expectations were definitely unrealistic. However, they do have a little bit of an advantage that, let's say you're aiming to get a graduate degree. Well, maybe you don't do that because that's going to be a smaller percentage, but maybe you do finish college, because that is one of the main reasons why millennials have done so well economically, is because more of them have a college education compared to Gen Xers and boomers. And people who have a college education tend to make more money. So that is one of the keys to their salaries and their wealth building. So in that way, it may have had that benefit.
Very interesting how the data really adds to the typical narratives and the typical kind of impressions we have of different generations. And then you look at the fuller picture and it's a lot more complex and a lot more multidimensional. Very, very interesting.